The conference room fell dead silent. Every eye in the room locked onto the woman standing at attention near the door, her crisp Navy uniform immaculate, despite the long journey that had brought her here. Captain Elena Rodriguez held her chin high, her dark eyes steady and unwavering as she stared directly at the man behind the mahogany desk, the same man who had systematically destroyed her career 5 years ago. Admiral Marcus Wellington sat frozen, his hand still raised in the traditional naval salute he expected to be returned. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His weathered face, lined with decades of command authority, showed the first flicker of confusion as seconds ticked by without the customary response. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, their coffee cups suspended halfway to their lips as they witnessed something that simply didn't happen in the United States Navy. Elena's refusal to return the salute wasn't born of disrespect or insubordination. It was a calculated decision, years in the making, that would either vindicate everything she had endured or end her naval career forever. The 4 words that would follow would change everything. The storm clouds had been gathering for weeks before Elena Rodriguez stepped foot aboard the USS Valiant for what everyone assumed would be the defining moment of her naval career. What they didn't know was that this moment had been 5 years in the making, born from betrayal, forged in determination, and tempered by an unwavering belief that the truth would eventually surface. Elena stood at the port rail of the transport vessel, watching the imposing silhouette of the aircraft carrier grow larger against the gray Atlantic horizon. The salty breeze whipped through her dark hair, but her expression remained stoic as memories flooded back, memories of the last time she had served under Admiral Wellington's command, when she was nothing more than a green lieutenant fresh out of the Naval Academy, with stars in her eyes and an unshakable faith in the system. She had sworn to serve. That faith had been shattered on a cold December morning in the Persian Gulf, when her career had been derailed not by enemy action or personal failure, but by the calculated machinations of a superior officer who believed that women had no place in combat operations. Admiral Wellington had been a captain then, commanding the destroyer USS Relentless, and Elena had been his communications officer, a position she had earned through academic excellence and rigorous training, only to find herself fighting a war on 2 fronts. The external enemy had been clear enough. Tensions in the Gulf had been escalating, with intelligence reports suggesting imminent attacks on American naval assets. But the internal enemy had been far more insidious, a commanding officer who questioned every decision she made, undermined her authority in front of junior enlisted personnel, and created an atmosphere where her competence was constantly called into question, not because of her performance, but because of her gender. Elena remembered the morning everything had come to a head. The USS Relentless had been conducting routine patrols when sonar detected an unidentified submarine signature approximately 12 nautical miles off their starboard bow. As the communications officer, Elena had been responsible for coordinating the response between the ship's various departments and maintaining contact with fleet headquarters. She had followed protocol to the letter, establishing communication links, coordinating with the sonar team, and preparing encrypted reports for transmission to the task force commander. But Captain Wellington had seen an opportunity to demonstrate what he believed was Elena's fundamental incompetence. In front of the entire bridge crew, he had publicly questioned her reading of the sonar data, suggesting that her interpretation was flawed and potentially dangerous to the ship. He had ordered her to stand down and assigned the coordination to Lieutenant Commander Harrison, a male officer with less experience, but what Wellington considered more reliable judgment. Elena had complied, as military protocol demanded, but she had also made a decision that would prove prescient. She had quietly documented every communication, every radar reading, and every piece of intelligence that crossed her station. When the submarine turned out to be a hostile contact that launched an unsuccessful attack on a nearby commercial vessel 6 hours later, Elena's original assessment was proven completely accurate. Her recommendations, if followed, would have resulted in the submarine's interdiction before it could threaten civilian shipping. The vindication should have been sweet, but Wellington had other plans. Rather than acknowledging his error, he had included a scathing performance evaluation in Elena's service record, citing her as inflexible in her thinking and unable to adapt to changing tactical situations. He had recommended against her promotion and suggested that she might be better suited to shore-based administrative duties where her limitations would be less likely to endanger military operations. The evaluation had been devastating to Elena's career trajectory. Despite her spotless record and commendations from other commanding officers, Wellington's assessment had followed her like a shadow. Promotion boards had looked unfavorably on her applications. Choice assignments had gone to less qualified officers, and she had found herself relegated to increasingly mundane positions that made little use of her extensive training and natural leadership abilities. For 3 years, Elena had watched her Naval Academy classmates advance through the ranks while she remained essentially frozen in place. She had considered resignation multiple times, but something deeper than pride kept her in uniform. It wasn't just about her own career, it was about every woman who would come after her, every qualified officer who might face similar treatment, and every young sailor who deserved to serve under leaders chosen for their competence rather than their conformity to outdated prejudices. The breaking point had come during her assignment to the Naval War College in Newport, where she had been sent ostensibly for advanced tactical training, but realistically because it was considered a safe place to park an officer whose career had stalled. Elena had thrown herself into her studies with the intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose, focusing particularly on naval strategy, joint operations, and the evolving nature of maritime warfare in an increasingly complex global environment. It was during this period that Elena had made a discovery that would change everything. While researching historical case studies for a paper on submarine warfare tactics, she had uncovered classified after-action reports from the Persian Gulf incident that had defined her relationship with Wellington. The reports, which had been declassified as part of a routine intelligence review, painted a picture completely at odds with Wellington's official account of events. According to the Fleet Intelligence Assessment, Elena's initial analysis of the submarine contact had been not just accurate, but remarkably sophisticated for an officer of her experience level. The report specifically noted that her recommendations for interdiction and tracking had been tactically sound and could have prevented the subsequent attack on civilian shipping. Most damaging to Wellington's credibility, the intelligence summary noted that the commanding officer of the USS Relentless had disregarded the advice of his communications officer, despite clear evidence supporting her assessment. Elena had spent weeks verifying the authenticity of these documents, cross-referencing them with other intelligence reports and operational summaries from the time period. The picture that emerged was one of systematic misrepresentation, where Wellington had not only failed to acknowledge his own tactical error, but had actively worked to shift blame to a subordinate officer. More troubling still, Elena had discovered that this pattern of behavior extended beyond her own case, with other female officers under Wellington's command reporting similar experiences of having their competence questioned and their careers undermined. Armed with this evidence, Elena had taken the most difficult step of her naval career. She had filed a formal complaint through the Inspector General's office, alleging that Admiral Wellington, who had been promoted despite his questionable leadership record, had engaged in systematic discrimination and career sabotage against female officers under his command. The complaint had triggered a comprehensive investigation that had taken 18 months to complete, during which Elena had endured intense scrutiny, legal depositions, and the constant stress of knowing that her naval career hung in the balance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The investigation's findings had been damning. The Inspector General's office had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning Wellington's entire command history, with multiple female officers reporting similar experiences of having their competence questioned, their decisions undermined, and their careers systematically derailed. The evidence Elena had discovered was corroborated by testimony from other officers, analysis of performance evaluations, and review of operational records that showed a clear disparity in how male and female officers were assessed and treated. Wellington's response to the investigation had been predictably defensive. He had claimed that his leadership style was demanding but fair, that his high standards applied equally to all officers regardless of gender, and that any perceived discrimination was the result of female officers being unable to meet the rigorous demands of naval leadership. He had characterized Elena's complaint as the desperate attempt of a failed officer to blame her shortcomings on gender bias rather than accepting responsibility for her own professional deficiencies. But the evidence had been overwhelming. The investigation had resulted in formal censure for Wellington, mandatory training on equal opportunity policies, and most significantly for Elena, the complete expungement of Wellington's negative evaluations from her service record. The promotion board had been instructed to review her case without the tainted evaluations, and within 6 months, Elena had been promoted to captain and assigned to one of the Navy's most prestigious commands. The assignment to the USS Valiant as executive officer had been more than just career rehabilitation, it had been validation. The Valiant was a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, one of the Navy's most important strategic assets, and the executive officer position was traditionally a stepping stone to ship command. Elena's assignment had sent a clear message throughout the fleet that merit, not gender, would determine advancement in the modern Navy, but fate had a sense of irony that even Elena hadn't anticipated. 3 months after her assignment to the Valiant, Admiral Wellington had been selected as the new commander of the Atlantic Fleet, making him the senior-most naval officer in Elena's chain of command. The man who had nearly destroyed her career was now, once again, in a position to influence her future. The news had reached Elena during a routine morning briefing aboard the Valiant. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the ship's commanding officer, and Elena's immediate superior, had delivered the information with characteristic directness. Mitchell was a seasoned officer who had herself navigated the challenges of being a woman in a traditionally male-dominated environment, and she understood the implications of Wellington's appointment better than most. "I know your history with Admiral Wellington," Captain Mitchell had said after dismissing the other officers from her cabin. "I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your abilities and your judgment. Whatever happened in the past, you've more than proven yourself in this assignment. The crew respects you, your performance evaluations are outstanding, and you've demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership this Navy needs." Elena had appreciated the support, but she had also recognized the delicate position her commanding officer was in. Captain Mitchell couldn't afford to appear partisan in any conflict between her executive officer and the fleet commander, regardless of her personal opinions about the situation. Elena would have to navigate this challenge on her own, drawing on the strength and wisdom she had gained during her years in professional purgatory. The opportunity for that confrontation had come sooner than expected. Admiral Wellington had announced his intention to conduct a comprehensive review of Atlantic Fleet operations, beginning with surprise inspections of major naval assets. The USS Valiant had been selected as his first inspection target, a choice that Elena suspected was anything but coincidental. Wellington was sending a message. He might have been censured for his past conduct, but he was still in command, and Elena's vindication hadn't changed the fundamental power dynamic between them. Elena had spent weeks preparing for the inspection, working closely with department heads to ensure that every aspect of the ship's operations met the highest standards. She had reviewed protocols, conducted training exercises, and personally inspected critical systems to guarantee that there would be no legitimate criticism of the ship's readiness or performance. If Wellington was looking for an opportunity to undermine her competence, she was determined not to give him one. The morning of the inspection had dawned gray and overcast, with heavy swells rolling across the Atlantic that made the massive carrier pitch and roll with unusual motion. Elena had been on the bridge since before sunrise, coordinating with the officer of the deck to ensure that all departments were ready for the Admiral's arrival. The ship's helicopter had been dispatched to collect Wellington and his inspection team from the fleet headquarters in Norfolk, and Elena had watched through binoculars as the aircraft approached through the morning mist. Wellington had stepped onto the flight deck with the bearing of a man who owned everything he surveyed. Despite being in his late 50s, he maintained the physical fitness and commanding presence that had characterized his entire naval career. His uniform was immaculate, his posture erect, and his expression reflected the confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own authority or judgment. Elena had observed him from the bridge wing as he was greeted by Captain Mitchell and the ship's senior staff, noting that he seemed entirely at ease despite the circumstances that had brought them together. The inspection had proceeded according to standard protocol for the first several hours. Wellington and his team had toured critical systems, reviewed operational procedures, and conducted interviews with key personnel. Elena had accompanied them as required by her position as executive officer, maintaining professional courtesy while documenting everything for her own records. Wellington had been polite but distant, treating her with the kind of cool correctness that acknowledged her presence without suggesting any personal recognition or warmth. It had been during the inspection of the communications center that the first sign of tension had emerged. Wellington had been reviewing the ship's communication protocols with the senior communications officer when he had asked a pointed question about encryption procedures for classified fleet communications. The communications officer, a competent but relatively inexperienced lieutenant commander, had hesitated slightly before providing an answer that was technically correct but lacked the depth of understanding that Wellington had been probing for. Elena had stepped forward to provide additional clarification, drawing on her extensive background in naval communications to explain not just the procedures themselves, but the strategic rationale behind their implementation. Her explanation had been comprehensive and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both technical and operational considerations that impressed the other inspection team members. Wellington's response had been subtle but unmistakable. Rather than acknowledging Elena's expertise, he had turned to Captain Mitchell and commented that it was refreshing to see executive officers taking such a hands-on approach to technical systems, the implication being that such detailed knowledge was unusual or somehow noteworthy rather than expected. Elena had recognized the comment for what it was, a way of diminishing her competence by suggesting that her knowledge was exceptional rather than simply professional. The pattern had continued throughout the morning. Whenever Elena had demonstrated expertise or provided insights that went beyond Wellington's expectations, he had found ways to minimize or deflect attention from her contributions. He had praised other officers for routine performance while subtly questioning Elena's judgment on matters where she had clearly been correct. It was a masterclass in subtle undermining, executed with the skill of someone who had been practicing such techniques for decades. Elena had endured it all with professional grace, documenting every interaction while maintaining the courteous demeanor expected of a senior officer. But she had also been calculating, waiting for the moment when Wellington would overplay his hand and provide her with the opening she needed to demonstrate just how much had changed since their last encounter. That moment had come during the inspection of the ship's Tactical Operations Center. Wellington had been reviewing the carrier's defensive capabilities with the ship's weapons officer when he had posed a hypothetical scenario involving a coordinated attack by enemy submarines and surface vessels. The weapons officer had provided a competent response outlining standard defensive procedures, but Wellington had pressed for more detail about specific tactical decisions and resource allocation priorities. Elena had listened to the exchange with growing interest, recognizing that Wellington was probing for exactly the kind of tactical sophistication that had been central to their original conflict. When the weapons officer had struggled to provide the level of strategic analysis Wellington was demanding, Elena had once again stepped forward to provide additional perspective. Her analysis had been brilliant. Drawing on years of study at the Naval War College and her extensive operational experience, Elena had outlined a comprehensive defensive strategy that addressed not just immediate threats, but also secondary and tertiary considerations that could affect the battle's outcome. She had discussed resource allocation, communication protocols, damage control priorities, and coordination with other fleet assets in a way that demonstrated both theoretical knowledge and practical understanding. The inspection team had been visibly impressed. Several officers had taken notes, and Elena had noticed approving nods as she had outlined particularly sophisticated elements of her tactical thinking. Even Wellington's aide, a sharp young commander who had been skeptical of Elena throughout the inspection, had shown clear signs of respect for her analysis. Wellington's reaction had been different. Rather than acknowledging Elena's expertise, he had become increasingly critical, questioning assumptions, challenging conclusions, and generally adopting the same undermining approach that had characterized their relationship years earlier. Elena had responded to each challenge with additional detail and clarification, demonstrating not just her initial competence, but her ability to defend her positions under scrutiny. The exchange had continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Wellington becoming increasingly aggressive in his questioning, while Elena had remained calm and professional in her responses. The other officers in the room had begun to show signs of discomfort as they recognized that this was no longer a routine inspection, but had become something more personal and confrontational. Captain Mitchell had finally intervened, suggesting that the inspection team move on to their next scheduled location. Wellington had agreed, but Elena had seen something in his expression that told her the confrontation was far from over. He had been testing her, pushing to see if she would crack under pressure the way she had as a young lieutenant. Instead, he had discovered that Elena Rodriguez had developed into exactly the kind of officer the Navy needed: competent, confident, and unshakable in her professional judgment. The final phase of the inspection had taken place in the ship's conference room, where Wellington traditionally conducted his concluding interviews with senior staff. Elena had been scheduled as the last interview, a positioning that she suspected was intentional. Wellington would want to end with the confrontation he had been building toward all day, the moment when he could finally demonstrate his continued authority over the officer who had dared to challenge him. Elena had prepared for this moment for years. She had studied every regulation, reviewed every precedent, and consulted with legal advisors to ensure that she understood exactly what she could and could not do within the constraints of military protocol. More importantly, she had prepared herself psychologically for what might be the defining moment of her naval career. When she had been summoned to the conference room, Elena had found Wellington seated behind the large mahogany table that dominated the space, his aide and two other members of the inspection team flanked on either side. The setting had been clearly designed to emphasize the power differential: Wellington in the position of authority, Elena standing at attention before him like a defendant awaiting judgment. Wellington had begun with routine questions about her duties aboard the Valiant, her assessment of the ship's readiness, and her perspectives on current naval operations. Elena had provided thorough, professional responses that demonstrated both her competence and her commitment to the mission. But she had also sensed that these were preliminary questions, building toward something more significant. The shift had come when Wellington had begun asking about Elena's background, her previous assignments, and her career trajectory. His questions had been carefully phrased to avoid direct reference to their shared history, but the implication had been clear. He had been probing for signs of the same uncertainty and defensive posture that had characterized their previous relationship. Elena had answered each question directly and confidently, providing details about her assignments, her training, and her professional development without any hint of apology or defensiveness. She had been particularly careful to highlight her advanced education, her operational experience, and the commendation she had received from other commanding officers. Wellington's frustration had become increasingly apparent as Elena had failed to respond to his subtle provocations with the kind of uncertainty he had been expecting. Finally, he had abandoned subtlety and had posed a direct challenge. "Captain Rodriguez," he had said, his voice carrying the tone of ultimate authority, "I've been reviewing your service record, and I have some concerns about your judgment and leadership capabilities. I want to be clear that my assessment of your performance will be based entirely on merit, not on any personal considerations or political correctness initiatives that might have influenced your previous promotions." The statement had been a masterpiece of plausible deniability, technically professional, but laden with implications about Elena's qualifications and the legitimacy of her advancement. It had been exactly the kind of statement that Wellington had perfected over the years, designed to undermine confidence while providing legal cover against charges of discrimination. Elena had felt a familiar surge of anger, the same emotion that had sustained her through years of professional exile and personal doubt. But this time, the anger had been tempered by confidence, knowledge, and most importantly, by the unshakable certainty that she belonged exactly where she was. She had looked directly into Wellington's eyes, seeing there the same arrogance and prejudice that had nearly destroyed her career years earlier. But she had also seen something else: uncertainty, perhaps even fear, as he had recognized that the young lieutenant he had once intimidated had evolved into something he couldn't control or manipulate. Wellington had continued his assessment, outlining what he characterized as deficiencies in Elena's leadership approach and questioning her ability to maintain proper discipline and operational effectiveness in high-stress situations. He had suggested that her previous commendations might have been the result of reduced standards rather than genuine competence, and he had implied that her current position might be beyond her actual capabilities. Elena had listened without interruption, maintaining eye contact and professional bearing while Wellington had systematically attempted to dismantle her confidence and authority. When he had finished, the room had fallen silent except for the distant hum of the ship's ventilation system and the subtle creaking of the hull as the Valiant had continued its transit through Atlantic swells. Wellington had then stood, his full admiral's insignia catching the overhead lighting as he had prepared to deliver what he clearly expected to be the coup de grace. He had moved around the table until he was standing directly in front of Elena, close enough that she could see the satisfaction in his eyes as he had prepared to reassert the dominance he believed was his by right. "Captain Rodriguez," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command, "I want you to understand that your conduct during this inspection has confirmed my assessment of your limitations as a naval officer. You will receive a formal evaluation reflecting these concerns, and I will be recommending to your commanding officer that serious consideration be given to your reassignment to duties more appropriate to your actual capabilities." Elena had felt the familiar chill of recognition. This was the same moment, replayed with variations, that had defined their relationship years earlier. Wellington was once again attempting to use his authority to destroy her career, this time with even greater power and influence at his disposal. But Elena Rodriguez was no longer the uncertain lieutenant who had been broken by Wellington's first assault on her career. The years of struggle, study, and professional development had forged her into something stronger and more dangerous than Wellington had anticipated. She had weapons now that she hadn't possessed before: knowledge, experience, and most importantly, the unshakable confidence that came from knowing she had already survived the worst he could do to her. Wellington had raised his hand in the traditional naval salute, a gesture that in this context carried multiple meanings. It was nominally a professional courtesy, but Elena had recognized it as something more: a final assertion of dominance, a reminder of the hierarchy that placed him above her, regardless of her competence or achievements. Elena had stood perfectly still, her arms at her sides, looking directly into Wellington's eyes as seconds had ticked by without the customary response. She had seen his initial confusion give way to anger as he had realized that she was not going to return his salute, that she was openly defying one of the most fundamental protocols of military courtesy. The other officers in the room had shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A junior officer's refusal to return a superior's salute was virtually unthinkable, a breach of protocol so serious that it could result in court-martial proceedings and the end of a military career. But Elena had calculated the risk carefully. She had documentation of Wellington's discriminatory conduct, legal precedent for her position, and most importantly, she had the moral authority that came from years of proven competence in the face of systematic undermining. This was her moment to draw a line that could never be crossed again. Wellington's hand had remained raised for what felt like an eternity, his face showing the progression from confusion to anger to something approaching genuine shock as he had realized that Elena was not going to back down. The silence in the room had become oppressive, broken only by the sound of the ship's movement through heavy seas. Finally, Elena had spoken, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the room with unmistakable authority. The 4 words she chose would indeed silence the room and change everything that followed. "I outrank you, sir." The words hung in the air like an explosive charge waiting to detonate. Elena Rodriguez watched as Admiral Wellington's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power within that conference room aboard the USS Valiant. Wellington's hand remained frozen in its salute position, his weathered features betraying the internal struggle as he processed what Elena had just declared. The other officers present exchanged glances of barely concealed shock, their training warring with their inability to comprehend what they were witnessing. "What did you say?" Wellington's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, though the menace beneath it was unmistakable. Elena maintained her rigid posture, her dark eyes never wavering from his pale blue ones. "You heard me correctly, Admiral. As of 0800 hours this morning, I hold the temporary rank of Rear Admiral Lower Half, United States Navy." The promotion order was signed by the Secretary of the Navy himself and countersigned by the Chief of Naval Operations. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, but her voice remained steady as she continued. "Therefore, Admiral Wellington, protocol dictates that you should be saluting me, not the other way around." Wellington's aide, Commander Patricia Hayes, fumbled with a tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she attempted to verify Elena's claim through the Naval Personnel Database. The soft clicking of her stylus against the device seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet that had settled over the room. "Sir," Commander Hayes said, her voice tight with disbelief, "the records confirm it. Emergency promotion orders dated this morning. Rear Admiral Rodriguez she's correct about the chain of command." The promotion had been the culmination of 18 months of careful political maneuvering that Elena had orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Following her vindication in the Inspector General's investigation, she had been approached by Senator Margaret Chun, the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, who had been conducting her own investigation into systemic discrimination within the military branches. Senator Chen had been impressed not only by Elena's persistence in challenging Wellington's conduct, but by her comprehensive documentation of the broader patterns of discrimination that affected female officers throughout the Navy. Elena's case had become the centerpiece of a larger reform initiative that was gaining momentum within both political and military circles. The senator had proposed something unprecedented, fast-tracking Elena for flag rank as part of a demonstration that the Navy was serious about promoting officers based on merit rather than traditional networking and political considerations. Elena's record, once cleansed of Wellington's sabotage, had been exemplary. Her performance as executive officer of the Valiant had exceeded all expectations. Her advanced education was beyond question, and most importantly, she had demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and leadership capability that the modern Navy needed. The process had been complex and politically sensitive. Elena's promotion had required approval from multiple levels of the naval hierarchy, review by congressional committees, and ultimately the personal authorization of both the Secretary of the Navy and the President himself. Elena had spent months in Washington testifying before committees, undergoing extensive background investigations, and proving herself to skeptics who questioned whether such an unprecedented promotion was justified. Throughout the process, Elena had been careful to maintain absolute discretion. She had continued her duties aboard the Valiant without any indication that her status was about to change dramatically, partly to avoid compromising the political process, and partly because she had wanted to preserve the element of surprise. For this exact moment, the timing of the promotion announcement had been calculated with surgical precision. Elena had known about Wellington's inspection schedule weeks in advance, and she had worked with Senator Chun's office to ensure that the promotion orders would be signed and delivered at exactly the moment when they would have maximum impact. Wellington would conduct his inspection, believing he was dealing with the same Captain Rodriguez he had once intimidated, only to discover that the power dynamic had shifted in ways he could never have anticipated. Wellington slowly lowered his hand, his face flushing red with a combination of anger and humiliation that Elena recognized from their previous encounters. But this time, she was no longer a vulnerable junior officer who could be intimidated or marginalized. She was now his superior in rank, with all the authority and protection that such status provided. "This is irregular," Wellington said, his voice strained with barely controlled rage. "Emergency promotions of this magnitude require extraordinary justification. I demand to see the authorization documents." Elena reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio that contained her promotion orders, complete with all required signatures and official seals. She handed the documents to Commander Hayes rather than directly to Wellington, a subtle but unmistakable assertion of her new authority. Hayes examined the documents carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each page she reviewed. "Sir, the orders appear to be completely legitimate. The justification cites exceptional performance in current assignment, advanced education and training credentials, demonstrated leadership under challenging circumstances, and special recognition for contributions to naval personnel policies and equal opportunity initiatives." The last phrase was diplomatic language for Elena's role in exposing Wellington's discriminatory conduct and her broader efforts to reform how the Navy treated its female officers. Elena had become something of a cause célèbre within progressive military circles, and her promotion was as much a symbol as it was a recognition of her individual achievements. Wellington's jaw worked silently as he processed the implications of Elena's new status. He was no longer dealing with a subordinate he could bully or intimidate. Elena Rodriguez was now a flag officer with her own authority, her own command responsibilities, and most importantly, her own ability to influence the careers of officers under her command, including, potentially, Wellington himself. "Admiral Rodriguez," Wellington said, the title seeming to stick in his throat like a foreign object. "I assume you have orders regarding your new assignment." Elena smiled for the first time since entering the conference room, an expression that held no warmth, but considerable satisfaction. "Actually, Admiral Wellington, my new assignment is quite relevant to our current situation. As of this afternoon, I will be assuming command of the Navy's new task force for personnel excellence and equal opportunity. My mandate includes reviewing the leadership effectiveness and command climate of all Atlantic Fleet operations." The implications were staggering. Elena was being given authority to investigate and evaluate the very officers who had once held power over her career. More specifically, she was being positioned to conduct a comprehensive review of Wellington's command of the Atlantic Fleet, with the authority to recommend changes in leadership assignments based on her findings. Wellington's aide looked as though she might faint. The other members of the inspection team shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly recognizing that they had just witnessed a complete reversal of fortune that none of them had seen coming. Elena Rodriguez had not only escaped Wellington's attempt to derail her career, she had positioned herself to potentially end his. "This is a witch hunt," Wellington said, his composure finally cracking. "A politically motivated vendetta disguised as military reform. You're using your gender and this equal opportunity nonsense to advance your own career at the expense of qualified officers who have served with distinction." Elena's expression hardened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who no longer had to tolerate such comments. "Admiral Wellington, you are out of line. Your statements constitute insubordination to a superior officer and demonstrate exactly the kind of thinking that this task force was created to address. I suggest you consider your next words very carefully." The rebuke was delivered with professional precision, but Elena felt a deep satisfaction in being able to finally respond to Wellington's attacks with the full weight of military authority behind her words. For years, she had been forced to endure his undermining tactics in silence, constrained by protocol and hierarchy from defending herself effectively. Now the tables had turned completely. Wellington seemed to recognize that he had overstepped, his face paling as he realized the precarious position he had placed himself in. Elena was no longer someone he could attack with impunity. She now had the rank, the authority, and the political support to respond to his aggression with consequences that could end his career. "Admiral Rodriguez," Wellington said, his voice carefully controlled, "I apologize for my inappropriate comments. The unusual circumstances of this situation caught me off guard. I meant no disrespect to your rank or authority." Elena nodded curtly, accepting the apology while making it clear that Wellington's behavior had been noted and would be remembered. "Apology accepted, Admiral. Now I believe we should return to the matter at hand. Your inspection of the USS Valiant is complete, and I assume you have findings to report." The remainder of the inspection debrief was conducted with strict military formality, but the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. Wellington went through the motions of completing his evaluation, but it was clear to everyone present that he was no longer in control of the situation. Elena answered his questions with professional courtesy, but there was no doubt about who held the real authority in the room. When the formal proceedings concluded, Elena requested a private meeting with Wellington, not as a subordinate seeking guidance, but as a superior officer with concerns about command effectiveness. The other members of the inspection team were dismissed, leaving Elena and Wellington alone in the conference room that had witnessed their confrontation. "Let me be clear about something, Admiral Wellington," Elena said once they were alone. "My promotion and new assignment are not about revenge. They're about ensuring that the Navy operates according to its highest principles and that all officers are evaluated based on their competence and character rather than irrelevant personal characteristics. Wellington remained silent, but Elena could see the calculation in his eyes as he tried to determine how to navigate this completely transformed relationship. However, Elena continued, my new responsibilities do include a comprehensive review of leadership effectiveness throughout the Atlantic Fleet. Your command will be subject to the same scrutiny as all others, and that review will be based entirely on operational results, personnel policies, and objective measures of command effectiveness. The message was clear. Elena was offering Wellington a path forward that didn't necessarily lead to professional destruction, but it would require him to operate according to standards that he had previously ignored. His treatment of female officers, his leadership methods, and his overall command philosophy would all be subject to rigorous evaluation. What exactly are you proposing? Wellington asked, his voice carefully neutral. I'm proposing that you have an opportunity to demonstrate that you can adapt to the modern Navy, Elena replied. Your operational expertise is undeniable, and the Navy needs experienced leaders. But those leaders must be capable of fostering an environment where all qualified officers can contribute to their full potential. Elena stood and moved to the conference room's windows, looking out at the gray Atlantic waters that stretched to the horizon. You made my early career unnecessarily difficult because of your personal prejudices. But I've learned from that experience, and it's made me a better officer. Now I'm in a position to ensure that other promising officers don't face the same obstacles I did. Wellington joined her at the windows, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly struggling with the fundamental shift in their relationship. And if I'm unable to meet your expectations? Elena turned to face him directly. Then you'll be relieved of command and reassigned to duties that don't involve personnel leadership. The Navy is changing, Admiral Wellington. Officers who can't adapt to that change will find themselves left behind. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. Captain Mitchell entered, her expression carefully professional, but Elena could see the curiosity in her eyes about what had transpired during the inspection. Admiral Rodriguez, Captain Mitchell said, the new title still sounding strange. Your helicopter is ready for departure whenever you're prepared to transfer to your new command. Elena nodded, gathering her materials while Wellington stood silently by the windows. The inspection that was supposed to have been his final assertion of dominance over her career had instead become her transition to a position of unprecedented authority within the Navy. As Elena prepared to leave the USS Valiant, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been a broken lieutenant whose career had been derailed by systematic discrimination. Today, she was a flag officer with the authority and responsibility to ensure that such discrimination could never again destroy the career of a qualified officer. The helicopter flight to Norfolk Naval Base, where her new command was located, gave Elena time to consider the challenges that lay ahead. Her task force was groundbreaking in its scope and authority, but it would also face resistance from officers who viewed equal opportunity initiatives as political correctness rather than military necessity. Elena's first priority would be establishing credibility within the naval community. Despite her promotion, there would be skeptics who questioned whether she had been advanced based on merit or political considerations. She would need to demonstrate through her actions and decisions that she was not only qualified for flag rank, but that her leadership would make the Navy more effective overall. The Task Force for Personnel Excellence and Equal Opportunity was housed in a newly constructed facility that reflected the Navy's commitment to the initiative. Elena's office was spacious and well-appointed, with secure communications equipment and access to personnel databases that would allow her to conduct comprehensive reviews of command effectiveness throughout the fleet. Her staff consisted of carefully selected officers from various backgrounds and specialties, chosen not for their political views, but for their expertise in personnel management, organizational psychology, and operational effectiveness. Elena had insisted that the task force include both male and female officers, with representation from different ethnic backgrounds and career specialties, to ensure that their evaluations would be as objective and comprehensive as possible. The first few weeks of Elena's new command were dedicated to establishing procedures and protocols for conducting command climate assessments. Her approach was methodical and data-driven, focusing on objective measures such as retention rates, promotion statistics, disciplinary actions, and anonymous surveys from personnel at all levels of the command structure. Elena was particularly careful to avoid any appearance of targeting specific officers or commands for political reasons. Her review process was designed to evaluate all Atlantic Fleet operations according to the same standards, with recommendations based entirely on evidence and operational results rather than personal considerations. However, it was inevitable that Wellington's command would receive special attention, given both his history of discriminatory conduct and his current position as one of the most senior officers in the Atlantic Fleet. Elena assigned her most experienced investigators to conduct a comprehensive review of fleet operations under Wellington's leadership, with particular attention to personnel policies and command effectiveness. The results of the investigation were troubling but not surprising. While Wellington had made some superficial changes to his leadership approach following his previous censure, the fundamental problems remained. Female officers under his command continued to report feeling marginalized and undervalued. Promotion rates for women and minorities lagged behind fleet-wide averages. Most significantly, several promising junior officers had requested transfers from Atlantic Fleet assignments, citing concerns about career development opportunities. Elena reviewed the findings carefully, cross-referencing them with operational data and performance metrics from other fleet commands. The pattern that emerged was clear. Commands with more inclusive leadership approaches consistently outperformed those that maintained traditional hierarchical structures that marginalized certain groups of officers. The evidence supported what Elena had long believed, that diversity and inclusion weren't just moral imperatives but operational advantages. Commands that effectively utilized the talents of all their personnel, regardless of gender or background, were more innovative, more adaptable, and ultimately more successful in accomplishing their missions. Armed with this data, Elena prepared her first major report as commander of the Task Force for Personnel Excellence and Equal Opportunity. The document was comprehensive and carefully documented, presenting her findings and recommendations in language that emphasized operational effectiveness rather than social justice concerns. The report's central recommendation was that Admiral Wellington be relieved of his command of the Atlantic Fleet and reassigned to a position that didn't involve direct personnel leadership. Elena supported this recommendation with extensive documentation of the command climate problems under Wellington's leadership, comparative data from other fleet commands, and projections of the operational improvements that could be expected from leadership changes. Elena knew that her recommendation would be controversial and would likely face significant resistance from traditionalist elements within the Navy. Wellington had powerful allies who would argue that his operational expertise outweighed any personnel management deficiencies. Elena would need to build a compelling case that demonstrated the connection between inclusive leadership and operational effectiveness. The opportunity to present her case came during a briefing to the Navy's senior leadership, including the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy. Elena had prepared meticulously for the presentation, anticipating every possible objection and preparing responses based on solid evidence and operational data. The briefing room was filled with the most senior officers in the Navy, many of whom had worked with Wellington throughout their careers and respected his operational expertise. Elena recognized that she was asking them to prioritize long-term organizational health over personal relationships and traditional ways of doing business. Elena began her presentation by outlining the mission and methodology of her task force, emphasizing the objective data-driven approach they had taken to evaluating command effectiveness. She presented statistics showing the relationship between inclusive leadership practices and operational performance, drawing on examples from successful commands throughout the Navy. When she turned specifically to the Atlantic Fleet evaluation, Elena was careful to present her findings in terms of operational impact, rather than personal criticism of Wellington's leadership style. She showed retention statistics, performance metrics, and survey data that painted a clear picture of systemic problems that were affecting the fleet's overall effectiveness. The most powerful part of her presentation was a comparison between the Atlantic Fleet's performance and that of other major commands. The data showed that the Atlantic Fleet, despite having excellent equipment and well-trained personnel, was underperforming in several key areas that correlated directly with personnel management practices. The evidence indicates that the Atlantic Fleet has significant untapped potential, Elena concluded. Our analysis suggests that changes in leadership approach could result in measurable improvements in operational effectiveness, personnel retention, and overall mission accomplishment. The questions that followed were pointed and sometimes skeptical, but Elena answered each one with specific data and concrete examples. Several senior officers challenged her methodology, questioned her conclusions, and suggested that her recommendations were based more on political considerations than military necessity. Elena responded to each challenge calmly and professionally, presenting additional evidence and clarifying her reasoning without becoming defensive or confrontational. She had anticipated these objections and had prepared responses that addressed the substantive concerns while demonstrating the solid foundation for her conclusions. The most challenging moment came when Admiral James Harrison, Wellington's longtime mentor and advocate, directly questioned whether Elena's personal history with Wellington had influenced her assessment. "Admiral Rodriguez," he said, "given your previous conflicts with Admiral Wellington, how can we be certain that your evaluation is objective rather than personally motivated?" Elena had known this question was coming and had prepared for it carefully. "Admiral Harrison, that's precisely why I recused myself from the direct evaluation of Admiral Wellington's command. The assessment was conducted entirely by other members of my staff, using the same methodology and criteria applied to all other commands under review. My personal history with Admiral Wellington had no bearing on the data collection or analysis." She paused, then continued with measured authority. "However, I would argue that my experience actually provides valuable perspective on the operational impact of ineffective personnel policies. I've seen firsthand how discrimination and bias can waste military talent and undermine unit effectiveness. That experience makes me better qualified, not less qualified, to identify and address these problems." The briefing concluded without a definitive decision, but Elena could sense that her presentation had been effective. Several senior officers had taken detailed notes, and she had noticed approving nods during key portions of her analysis. Most importantly, no one had been able to effectively challenge the substance of her findings or the validity of her recommendations. Over the following weeks, Elena continued to build support for her recommendations through individual meetings with key decision-makers. She provided additional data, answered follow-up questions, and gradually assembled a coalition of senior officers who recognized the need for change in the Atlantic Fleet's leadership. The decision, when it finally came, was both satisfying and sobering. Admiral Wellington would be relieved of his command of the Atlantic Fleet and reassigned to a strategic planning position at the Pentagon, where his operational expertise could be utilized without direct personnel leadership responsibilities. The assignment was face-saving rather than punitive, allowing Wellington to continue his naval career while removing him from a position where his leadership deficiencies could continue to damage the Navy's effectiveness. Elena felt no personal satisfaction in Wellington's reassignment. Her goal had never been revenge, but rather the creation of a navy, where all qualified officers could serve and advance based on their merit rather than their conformity to outdated expectations. Wellington's removal was simply a necessary step in that larger transformation. The announcement of the leadership change was accompanied by Elena's appointment as the acting commander of a new personnel development initiative that would implement her task force's recommendations throughout the Navy. Her temporary promotion to Rear Admiral was made permanent, and she was given broad authority to restructure personnel policies and leadership training programs. Elena's transformation from nearly destroyed junior officer to flag officer with unprecedented authority was now complete. But she recognized that her real work was just beginning. The Navy she envisioned one where competence and character mattered more than gender or background would require years of sustained effort to achieve. She had proven that change was possible, but implementing that change throughout the entire service would be her greatest challenge yet. Standing in her new office, looking out at the naval base where her remarkable journey had brought her, Elena Rodriguez reflected on the path that had led from near career destruction to a position where she could shape the future of naval leadership. The scared lieutenant who had once been intimidated by Admiral Wellington's prejudice was gone forever, replaced by a confident flag officer with the authority and determination to ensure that no other promising officer would face the same obstacles she had overcome. The real victory wasn't her promotion or Wellington's reassignment. It was the knowledge that the Navy was finally beginning to live up to its highest ideals of merit-based leadership and equal opportunity for all who served with honor. 18 months had passed since Admiral Elena Rodriguez had assumed command of the Navy's transformative personnel initiatives, and the results spoke louder than any speech or policy document ever could. The changes she had implemented were no longer experimental programs or hopeful theories. They had become demonstrable improvements in naval readiness, operational effectiveness, and personnel satisfaction across the entire Atlantic Fleet. Elena stood at the podium of the Naval War College auditorium, addressing an audience of senior officers from all branches of the military. Her presentation on leadership excellence in modern naval operations had drawn attendees from around the world, military leaders eager to understand how the U.S. Navy had achieved such remarkable improvements in both operational performance and personnel retention. The statistics Elena presented were compelling. Under the new leadership policies she had developed, the Navy had seen a 23% increase in retention rates among high-performing officers, a 37% reduction in formal discrimination complaints, and most significantly, measurable improvements in unit effectiveness across multiple operational areas. Ships and commands that had fully embraced her inclusive leadership principles were consistently outperforming their peers in readiness assessments, training exercises, and real-world deployments. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. Elena had received hundreds of personal letters from officers throughout the fleet, thanking her for creating an environment where their talents could be fully utilized regardless of their gender, ethnicity, or background. Young female officers wrote about finally feeling confident that their careers would be judged on merit rather than prejudice. Male officers reported that the more collaborative leadership approaches had actually enhanced their own professional development and job satisfaction. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Elena had faced significant resistance from traditionalist elements within the Navy who viewed her reforms as political correctness rather than operational necessity. Some senior officers had requested transfers rather than adapt to the new expectations for inclusive leadership. Few had openly criticized her policies in professional forums, arguing that she was sacrificing military effectiveness for social engineering. Elena had responded to each challenge with the same approach that had characterized her entire tenure: data-driven analysis, professional competence, and unwavering commitment to operational excellence. When critics argued that her policies would weaken military discipline, she presented evidence showing improved unit cohesion in commands that had embraced inclusive leadership. When skeptics claimed that diversity initiatives would lower standards, she demonstrated that units with more diverse leadership actually performed better on standardized assessments. Her most significant vindication had come 6 months earlier. During a major NATO exercise in the North Atlantic, Elena had been selected to command the multinational task force, a role that placed her in charge of naval assets from 12 different countries in a complex simulation of modern maritime warfare. The exercise was designed to test not only tactical competence, but also the ability to coordinate diverse forces under challenging conditions. Elena's performance had been exceptional. Drawing on her extensive experience with inclusive leadership principles, she had successfully integrated the different national naval traditions, communication styles, and operational approaches into a cohesive fighting force. Her task force had achieved all primary objectives while maintaining the highest levels of international cooperation and mutual respect among participating units. The success of the NATO exercise had elevated Elena's reputation beyond the U.S. Navy. She was now recognized internationally as one of the leading experts on modern naval leadership and was frequently invited to speak at military academies and strategic institutes around the world. Her book, Leading Forward: Inclusive Excellence in Military Operations, had become required reading at staff colleges throughout the NATO alliance. But Elena's greatest satisfaction came not from international recognition or professional accolades. It came from knowing that she had fundamentally changed how the Navy developed and utilized its human resources. The young officers serving under commanders who had embraced her leadership principles were thriving in ways that previous generations of naval personnel could never have imagined. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Park was a perfect example of this transformation. A brilliant tactical officer who had been struggling under a traditional command structure that undervalued her contributions, Park had flourished once assigned to a unit led by one of Elena's protégés. Within 18 months, she had been selected for accelerated promotion and was now being considered for command of her own vessel, an opportunity that would have been virtually impossible under the old system. Elena made it a point to personally mentor promising officers like Park, sharing the lessons she had learned during her own difficult journey and ensuring that they had the support and guidance she had been denied as a young lieutenant. These mentoring relationships had become one of the most rewarding aspects of her new role, allowing her to directly impact individual careers while building a new generation of inclusive leaders. The ripple effects of Elena's work extended far beyond individual success stories. The Navy's improved personnel policies had attracted higher quality recruits, as word spread that military service could offer genuine career opportunities for people from all backgrounds. Retention rates had improved across all demographic categories, saving the Navy millions of dollars in training costs and preserving institutional knowledge that had previously been lost when talented officers left the service prematurely. Elena's influence was perhaps most visible in the dramatic increase in the number of women minorities advancing to senior leadership positions. The promotion rates for these groups had more than doubled in the 18 months since her reforms were implemented, not because standards had been lowered, but because barriers that had artificially limited their advancement had been removed. Admiral Marcus Wellington's career trajectory during this period served as an interesting counterpoint to Elena's success. His reassignment to the Pentagon Strategic Planning Office had initially been viewed as career-ending exile, but Wellington had surprised many observers by embracing the opportunity for reflection and professional growth. Away from direct personnel leadership responsibilities, he had been able to contribute his operational expertise, while gradually recognizing the validity of Elena's approach to leadership development. Their relationship had evolved from antagonistic to professionally respectful, though it would never be warm. Wellington had even attended one of Elena's presentations at the Naval War College, sitting in the back of the auditorium and listening without comment as she outlined the principles that had transformed the Atlantic Fleet's performance. After the presentation, he had approached her briefly to acknowledge that her methods had achieved results he hadn't believed possible. Elena accepted Wellington's grudging recognition for what it was, an admission that his previous judgments had been wrong, rather than a personal apology for the damage he had caused to her career and the careers of other officers. It was progress, even if it fell short of the accountability she might have preferred. The real test of Elena's transformation of naval culture came during an unexpected crisis that erupted in the Eastern Mediterranean. Terrorist attacks on commercial shipping had prompted a multinational response, with Elena selected to command a hastily assembled task force responsible for protecting merchant vessels while hunting down the attackers. The operation, designated Neptune Shield, presented exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes challenge that tested every aspect of military leadership. Elena's task force included vessels from 6 different navies, each with their own operational procedures, communication protocols, and cultural expectations. Coordinating their efforts while maintaining operational security and achieving tactical objectives required precisely the kind of inclusive leadership skills that Elena had spent years developing. The terrorists proved to be more sophisticated and dangerous than initial intelligence had suggested. Rather than operating as isolated cells, they had formed a coordinated network capable of simultaneous attacks across multiple shipping lanes. Their tactics evolved rapidly, forcing Elena to continuously adapt her defensive strategies while maintaining the delicate international cooperation that made the mission possible. Elena's approach to the crisis exemplified everything she had learned about modern military leadership. Rather than attempting to impose a single operational framework on all participating units, she established common objectives while allowing each national contingent to contribute according to their particular strengths. She created integrated planning teams that drew on the diverse expertise available within her multinational force, ensuring that tactical decisions benefited from multiple perspectives and specialized knowledge. The communication systems Elena established for the operation became a model for international military cooperation. She insisted on regular briefings that included not just senior commanders but also junior officers who often had the most current tactical intelligence. These briefings were conducted in a collaborative style that encouraged input from all participants, regardless of their nationality or rank. When the first major engagement occurred, Elena's inclusive leadership approach proved its worth under actual combat conditions. The terrorist attack involved coordinated strikes by fast attack craft against a convoy of civilian tankers, requiring immediate response from multiple naval units operating under different command structures. Elena's task force responded with precision and effectiveness that exceeded all expectations. Units from different navies coordinated seamlessly, sharing targeting information and tactical updates in real time while maintaining the situational awareness necessary to avoid friendly fire incidents. The attack was repelled with minimal damage to the civilian vessels and significant losses among the terrorist forces. The success continued over the following weeks as Elena's task force systematically dismantled the terrorist network. Her approach combined aggressive tactical operations with sophisticated intelligence analysis, drawing on expertise from throughout the international coalition to build a comprehensive understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. The decisive action came when Elena's intelligence teams, working with analysts from multiple countries, identified the main terrorist base of operations on a remote island in the Eastern Mediterranean. The facility was heavily fortified and defended, requiring a complex amphibious assault that would test every aspect of multinational military cooperation. Elena spent 3 days planning the operation, working closely with Marine commanders. special operations forces, and naval aviation assets from the participating countries. The planning process exemplified her leadership philosophy, with detailed input from officers at all levels and careful consideration of how different national military traditions could be integrated into a cohesive operational plan. The assault itself was executed with textbook precision. Elena commanded the operation from her flagship, coordinating airstrikes, naval gunfire support, and the amphibious landing while maintaining constant communication with political leaders in the participating countries. The terrorist base was captured with minimal coalition casualties and significant intelligence materials that led to the disruption of other terrorist cells throughout the region. The success of Operation Neptune Shield elevated Elena's reputation to new heights within international military circles. She was awarded decorations from 6 different countries and was invited to brief the United Nations Security Council on the operation's innovative approach to multinational military cooperation. More importantly for Elena's long-term goals, the operation provided concrete evidence that inclusive leadership principles could succeed under the most challenging conditions possible. The after-action reports from participating nations consistently praised the collaborative approach Elena had fostered, noting that the operation's success had depended on the effective integration of diverse military capabilities and perspectives. Elena's personal involvement in the operation had also demonstrated her continued commitment to leading from the front when necessary. Despite her flag rank and strategic responsibilities, she had insisted on remaining with the task force throughout the operation, sharing the same risks as the sailors and Marines under her command. Her presence had been noticed and appreciated by personnel throughout the international coalition, reinforcing her credibility as a combat leader rather than merely a policy reformer. The conclusion of Operation Neptune Shield marked Elena's emergence as one of the most respected military leaders of her generation. She was promoted to Vice Admiral and selected to command the newly created Joint Personnel Excellence Center, a position that would allow her to extend her leadership development programs to all branches of the U.S. military. The promotion ceremony was held at the Pentagon with attendance from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. As Elena stood at attention while the 3-star insignia was pinned to her uniform, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. A uncertain lieutenant who had once been intimidated by Admiral Wellington's prejudice had evolved into a flag officer whose leadership principles were being adopted throughout the American military and beyond. Elena's acceptance speech was brief but powerful. She spoke about the importance of judging all military personnel by their competence and character, rather than by irrelevant personal characteristics. She emphasized that inclusive leadership wasn't about lowering standards or pursuing political correctness. It was about maximizing the effectiveness of military organizations by ensuring that all qualified personnel could contribute to their full potential. The audience included many of the officers who had once been skeptical of Elena's approach to leadership development. Admiral Harrison, Wellington's former mentor, was among those who applauded enthusiastically as Elena outlined her vision for the future of American military leadership. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was clearly irreversible. As the ceremony concluded, Elena noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the auditorium. Admiral Wellington, now approaching retirement, had attended the ceremony. Despite having no official role in the proceedings, their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, and Wellington offered a respectful nod that Elena interpreted as acknowledgement of her achievements. Later that evening, as Elena was preparing to leave the Pentagon, Wellington approached her in the parking garage. They stood facing each other in the artificial lighting, 2 officers whose careers had become permanently intertwined through conflict and eventual understanding. "Congratulations on your promotion," Wellington said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "You've achieved something remarkable." Elena nodded, accepting the compliment while maintaining the professional distance that would always characterize their relationship. "Thank you, Admiral. The Navy is stronger because of the changes we've implemented." Wellington was quiet for a moment, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily to him. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. "Not just for what I did to your career, but for my failure to recognize the potential that was right in front of me. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and the Navy suffered because of it." The apology was more than Elena had ever expected to receive, and she felt a surprising sense of closure at hearing it. "I appreciate you saying that," she replied. "What matters now is that we've learned from those mistakes and created a better system for the officers who come after us." Wellington extended his hand, and Elena shook it firmly. "The Navy is fortunate to have leaders like you," he said. "I hope the next generation of officers will benefit from your example." As Wellington walked away, Elena stood alone in the parking garage, processing the significance of their final interaction. The man who had once nearly destroyed her career had acknowledged his mistakes and recognized her achievements. It was a form of personal vindication, but Elena realized that she no longer needed Wellington's approval or recognition to validate her worth as an officer. Elena's transformation was complete, but her work was far from finished. As the new commander of the Joint Personnel Excellence Center, she would have the opportunity to extend her leadership development programs throughout the American military, ensuring that the principles she had pioneered in the Navy would benefit all branches of service. The young officers now entering military service would grow up in an environment where inclusive leadership was the norm rather than the exception. They would be judged on their competence and character, trained by commanders who understood that diversity of thought and background strengthened rather than weakened military effectiveness, and mentored by leaders who had learned that the military's greatest strength lay not in its weapons or technology but in its people. Elena Rodriguez had refused to salute not out of disrespect, but out of a determination to demand the respect she had earned through years of exemplary service. The 4 words she had spoken in that conference room aboard the USS Valiant, "I outrank you, sir," had been more than a statement of military hierarchy. They had been a declaration that merit and competence would triumph over prejudice and tradition, that the future of American military leadership would be defined by excellence rather than exclusion. Standing in the Pentagon parking garage, wearing the 3 stars of a vice admiral and carrying the authority to shape military leadership for generations to come, Elena Rodriguez had become living proof that the American military's promise of advancement based on merit could be more than just an ideal. It could be reality for all who served with honor and distinction. The transformation was complete. The work would continue. And the Navy, indeed, all of American military leadership would be stronger because one young lieutenant had refused to accept that prejudice and discrimination were simply the price of military service. Elena Rodriguez had changed everything, not through confrontation or politics, but through the simple insistence that competence and character matter more than any other qualification for leadership. Her legacy would be measured not in the positions she had achieved or the recognition she had received, but in the careers of thousands of officers who would serve in a military that finally lived up to its highest ideals. The scared lieutenant who had once been broken by discrimination had become the flag officer who ensured that no other promising leader would face the same obstacles. The revolution was complete. The future was now in the hands of the officers. Elena Rodriguez had trained, mentored, and inspired to lead with both excellence and inclusion. And in that future, every qualified individual who chose to serve their country would have the opportunity to rise as high as their talent, dedication, and character could take them. 5 years later, Admiral Elena Rodriguez stood on the deck of the USS Constitution during her retirement ceremony, watching as hundreds of officers filled the historic ship's deck to honor her service. The gathering represented more than just a farewell to a distinguished naval career. It was a celebration of the fundamental transformation she had brought to American military leadership. The ceremony was unlike any retirement event in recent naval history. Among the attendees were officers from every branch of the military, representing the broad impact of Elena's leadership development programs. International military leaders had traveled from dozens of countries to participate, testimony to the global influence of her inclusive leadership principles. Captain Maria Santos, one of Elena's first protégés, served as the master of ceremonies. Santos had risen through the ranks faster than anyone in her year group, now commanding her own destroyer and preparing for selection to flag rank herself. Her success embodied everything Elena had worked to achieve, proof that talent and determination could flourish when artificial barriers were removed. As Santos recounted Elena's achievements, the statistics were staggering. During Elena's tenure leading personnel excellence initiatives, the military had seen its highest retention rates in decades, with particular improvements among high-performing officers from underrepresented groups. Combat readiness assessments showed consistent improvements in units that had fully embraced inclusive leadership practices. Most significantly, the military academies reported their most diverse and academically accomplished incoming classes. In history, General Patricia Hawthorne, the first woman to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, delivered the keynote address. Her own advancement had been accelerated by the cultural changes Elena had championed, and she spoke passionately about the transformation of military culture over the past decade. Admiral Rodriguez didn't just change policies, General Hawthorne declared to the assembled crowd. She changed minds. She proved that our military becomes stronger when we judge our people by their character and competence rather than by characteristics that have nothing to do with their ability to serve our nation. The ceremony included video messages from political leaders, international military commanders, and dozens of junior officers whose careers had been shaped by Elena's mentorship. Each speaker emphasized different aspects of her legacy, some focused on operational improvements, others on policy innovations, but all recognized her fundamental impact on military culture. President Elizabeth Chun, daughter of the former senator who had first championed Elena's advancement, delivered remarks via video link from the White House. Admiral Rodriguez exemplifies the best of American military leadership, the president said. Her service reminds us that our strength comes not from excluding talented individuals but from embracing the full diversity of American excellence. The most moving moment came when Admiral Wellington, now fully retired, approached the podium for an unscheduled speech. The crowd fell silent as the elderly officer, walking slowly but with dignity, took his place before the microphone. "I stand before you today to speak about redemption," Wellington began, his voice carrying clearly across the ship's deck. "Not my own redemption, though I hope I have earned some measure of that, but the redemption of an institution that had lost sight of its own values." Wellington spoke about his own evolution from skeptic to supporter, acknowledging the mistakes that had nearly destroyed promising careers and weakened the military as a whole. His words were carefully chosen but unflinchingly honest about the prejudices that had clouded his judgment for too many years. "Admiral Rodriguez forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves," Wellington continued. "She showed us that our definition of military excellence had been too narrow, our understanding of leadership too limited. The Navy she leaves behind is stronger, smarter, and more capable than the one she inherited." When Wellington finished speaking, he walked directly to Elena and rendered a perfect salute, one that she returned with equal precision. The symbolism was lost on no one present. The officer who had once refused to recognize her worth now publicly acknowledged her superiority as a leader and her importance to the institution they both served. Elena's own remarks were characteristically focused on the future rather than the past. She spoke about the young officers now entering military service, men and women who would grow up in an environment where their potential would be limited only by their own ambition and dedication. The changes we've implemented aren't about political correctness or social engineering, Elena told the crowd. They're about military effectiveness. They're about ensuring that our armed forces can draw upon the full spectrum of American talent to meet the challenges of an increasingly complex world. She highlighted specific success stories officers who had overcome early career setbacks to achieve positions of significant responsibility, innovative tactical developments that had emerged from diverse planning teams, and operational successes that demonstrated the practical value of inclusive leadership. Elena also spoke about the international impact of American military reforms. Partner nations had adopted similar programs, leading to improved cooperation in joint operations and enhanced respect for American military professionalism around the world. The soft power benefits of demonstrating commitment to equal opportunity had strengthened alliance relationships and enhanced America's moral authority in international forums. The ceremony concluded with the traditional passing of the command flag, though in Elena's case, there was no single successor to her unique role. Instead, the flag was presented to the newly established Institute for Military Leadership Excellence, a permanent institution that would continue developing and implementing the programs Elena had pioneered. As the formal proceedings ended, Elena found herself surrounded by young officers eager to thank her personally for creating opportunities they might never have had under the old system. Lieutenant Commander James Park, whose sister Sarah had thrived under Elena's mentorship programs, spoke for many when he said, "You didn't just change the military, Admiral. You changed what it means to be an American service member." The personal conversations continued long into the evening as Elena moved through the crowd of well-wishers. Each interaction reinforced her sense that the changes she had implemented would endure long after her retirement. The officers now leading military units had been trained in inclusive leadership principles and understood their practical value in maintaining effective organizations. Elena was particularly struck by conversations with international officers who had come to learn from American military reforms. A British Royal Navy commander spoke about implementing similar programs in her own service, while a German Army colonel described how Elena's leadership principles had influenced NATO training standards. As the ceremony wound down, Elena stepped away from the crowd to stand alone at the ship's rail, looking out across Boston Harbor. The USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, had witnessed more than 2 centuries of American naval history, serving as both warship and symbol of the nation's maritime heritage. Elena reflected on how much had changed during her career. The young lieutenant who had been nearly broken by discrimination would hardly recognize the military environment that now existed. Women and minorities served at every level of command, their advancement limited only by their individual capabilities and dedication. The transformation hadn't been without costs. Some traditional military families had struggled to adapt to changing expectations, and a few promising officers had left the service rather than embrace new leadership approaches. But the overall impact had been overwhelmingly positive, creating a military that was both more effective and more representative of the society it served. Elena's personal satisfaction came not from the honors and recognition she had received, but from knowing that future generations of service members would face fewer artificial barriers to their advancement. The military academies now graduated classes that looked like America itself, and promotion boards evaluated officers based on performance metrics that emphasized competence and character over conformity to outdated stereotypes. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Elena's former Naval Academy roommate who had left the military to pursue an academic career, joined her at the rail as the crowd began to disperse. Martinez was now a professor of military history at Georgetown University, where she taught courses on organizational change and leadership development. "You did it," Martinez said simply. "You actually changed the entire culture of an institution that everyone said was impossible to reform." Elena smiled, feeling a deep sense of completion. "We did it," she corrected. "None of this would have been possible without support from people like you, from political leaders who took risks, from junior officers who believed change was possible." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "The history books will remember you as the officer who proved that military excellence and social progress aren't incompatible, they're mutually reinforcing." As the evening progressed, Elena found herself in conversation with Captain Amy Chun, the president's cousin and one of the Navy's most promising young submarine commanders. Chun represented everything Elena had hoped to achieve: a brilliant officer whose advancement had been based entirely on merit, serving in positions that had been close to women throughout most of naval history. "What advice would you give to officers like me?" Chun asked. "How do we maintain the progress you've achieved while continuing to push forward?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Remember that excellence is non-negotiable," she said. "The moment we accept lower standards for anyone, regardless of their background, we undermine everything we've accomplished. Demand the best from everyone, support those who struggle, and never apologize for expecting competence and character from every service member." Chun nodded thoughtfully. "And what about resistance?" "There are still officers who believe the old ways were better." "Lead by example," Elena replied. "Let your performance speak for itself. The best argument for inclusive leadership is successful operations and effective units. When skeptics see the results, most of them become converts." As the retirement ceremony finally concluded, Elena was approached by a young ensign who had graduated from the Naval Academy just months earlier. Ensign David Rodriguez was no relation to Elena, but his presence represented the future she had worked to create. "Admiral," the young officer said nervously, "I just wanted to thank you. My older sister tried to join the Navy 8 years ago and left because she felt like she didn't belong. I'm here because you made it possible for people like us to serve without having to prove we deserve to be here." Elena was moved by the comment, understanding that her legacy would ultimately be measured not in policy documents or organizational charts, but in individual lives and careers that had been made possible by her efforts. The final moment of the ceremony came when Elena was presented with a special flag that had flown over every major naval installation where her reforms had been implemented. The flag would accompany her into retirement, a symbol of the institutions she had changed and the lives she had touched. As Elena left the USS Constitution for the final time as an active duty officer, she was surrounded by the men and women who would continue her work. They were admirals and captains, commanders and lieutenants, representing every corner of the military establishment and every community within American society. The transformation Elena Rodriguez had begun with 4 simple words, "I outrank you, sir," had grown into something far beyond what anyone could have imagined. She had not merely achieved personal vindication or career success. She had fundamentally altered the trajectory of American military culture. Walking down the gangplank of the historic ship, Elena knew that her active service was ending, but her influence would continue for generations. The officers she had mentored would train others. The policies she had implemented would evolve and improve, and the principles she had championed would guide military leadership long into the future. The scared lieutenant who had once been told she didn't belong in the military had become the admiral who ensured that every qualified American could serve with dignity and advance based on merit. The revolution was complete, but its legacy would endure as long as the American military continued to serve the nation and defend its values. Elena Rodriguez had refused to salute not out of disrespect, but out of a profound respect for what the military could become. Her 4 words had silenced a room, but her lifetime of service had given voice to countless others who would follow in her footsteps, serving with honor and advancing based on the content of their character and the quality of their contributions to the defense of freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the Mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.